A retired war photographer stumbles upon an old roll of undeveloped film, expecting nothing more than memories of the past, until he sees one final image that shakes him to his core. A cryptic message hidden in the photo leads him to the son of a soldier who never made it home, unraveling a decades-old mystery buried in silence. But when the truth finally comes to light, will it bring long overdue justice, or expose a secret that was meant to stay forgotten? The attic smelled of dust and old paper. Jack Callahan knelt beside a stack of aging storage boxes, his fingers brushing over faded labels written in his own handwriting from decades ago. Vietnam 1971. The words stared back at him from the lid of a battered shoebox, the edges worn, as if time itself had tried to erase its contents. He hesitated before pulling the box toward him. He wasn't sentimental about his past, not anymore. He had spent years burying it under work, whiskey, and a quiet, almost self-imposed exile from the world. But now, in the twilight of his life, something about this moment felt different. Lifting the lid, Jack found what he expected: old notebooks filled with scribbled names and coordinates, yellowed newspaper clippings from his war correspondent days, and a handful of black-and-white photographs, images he hadn't seen since he first took them. Then he saw it. A small, tightly wound roll of undeveloped film sat buried beneath the photographs, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. His chest tightened. He didn't remember leaving any film undeveloped. He had always been meticulous about his work. Jack held the film up to the dim light filtering through the attic's single window. The negatives inside were a mystery, locked away in the past, a past that had taken too much from him already. A bell jingled above the door as Jack stepped into the small photography shop on Lakeshore Drive. It was one of the last of its kind, a relic in a world that had long since traded film for pixels. The scent of chemicals and old paper filled the air, transporting him back to another time. A younger man behind the counter, Mike Davis, glanced up from his work. "Whoa," he said, eyeing the film canister Jack set on the counter. "You don't see these every day." Jack smirked. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you how old it is." Mike turned the canister in his fingers. "You sure it's still good?" "No idea, but I need to find out." "All right," Mike said, already setting up the darkroom. "Come back in a couple of hours. We'll see if there's anything left to salvage." Jack nodded, but as he left, a strange unease settled in his gut. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but something told him this film had been waiting for him for a reason. Jack sat in his truck across from Davis Film and Photo, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. He had never been a man to dwell on the past, but waiting for those photos to develop had him feeling like a soldier anticipating bad news from command. 2 hours felt longer than the decades that had already passed. His gut told him that whatever was on that roll of film mattered. Maybe it was the final remnants of a time he tried to forget. Or maybe it was something more, something buried for a reason. Finally, he climbed out of his truck and walked inside. Mike was waiting at the counter, flipping through a stack of fresh prints, his expression unreadable. When he saw Jack, he exhaled slowly. "You're going to want to see this," he muttered. Jack felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. Mike slid the stack of black and white photos across the counter. Jack reached out, hesitant, before picking them up. The first few images were standard. Soldiers in the jungle, exhausted but smiling for the camera. A helicopter parked in a clearing, the rotor blades blurred by motion. Local children standing barefoot in the dirt, curiosity in their wide eyes. And then came the last one. Jack froze. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Sergeant Tom Grady, crouched in the jungle, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking past it, his expression intense, as if he had just heard something. And then Jack saw it, etched into the dirt beside Tom's boot, barely noticeable, a message. Or numbers. Jack's throat tightened. He stared at the numbers, his heart pounding. Tom had gone missing the very next day. Jack never saw him again. He gripped the edge of the counter, his mind racing. "You okay?" Mike asked. Jack didn't answer. His fingers traced the edges of the photograph, as if trying to pull something from the past into the present. Coordinates? A message from beyond the grave? Or was it something else? Jack exhaled sharply and pocketed the photo. There was only one way to find out. Jack sat at his kitchen table, the old photo spread out in front of him. His reading glasses rested on the tip of his nose, and a weathered map of Vietnam lay beside the photograph. The coordinates: 16 degree 42, 10, N 106 degree 45, 27, E. His finger hovered over the location on the map, a dense patch of jungle near the Laotian border, not far from where their last patrol had been. Jack rubbed his temples. Tom Grady had been his best friend, the only man who truly had his back in a war where survival meant trusting no one. He had been reported MIA, presumed dead, and after so many years, Jack had accepted it. Until now. Something about that message in the dirt, written as if Tom had meant for someone to find it, gnawed at him. Jack pulled his laptop closer, typing the coordinates into Google Earth. The modern satellite imagery revealed nothing but jungle, the kind that swallowed men whole and kept their stories buried forever. If this place had an answer, it had been hidden for decades. Jack exhaled sharply, closing the laptop. A search of military records told him what he already knew. Tom Grady never came home. But a name caught his eye, buried in an old declassified report. Elaine Grady. Jack's brow furrowed. Tom's sister. They hadn't spoken since the war. Tom's family had suffered in silence, clinging to the last scraps of hope that he might return long after the world moved on. Jack pulled out an old address book, the pages brittle with time. He flipped through until he found it. Grady, Elaine, Murfreesboro, 10. Jack stared at the name, his fingers tightening around the edges of the book. He hadn't planned on digging into ghosts when he woke up that morning, but now it felt inevitable. He grabbed his jacket, car keys, and the photograph, stuffing them into his bag. By morning, he'd be in Tennessee. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally get some answers. Jack's truck rumbled down a 2-lane highway in Tennessee, winding through stretches of farmland and scattered pine trees. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was far from calm. It had been over 50 years since he'd last spoken to Elaine Grady. Back then, she was just a teenager, her brother's biggest fan, always writing him letters and waiting for his return. He never did. Jack pulled into a small driveway beside a weathered farmhouse, its white paint peeling from decades of sun and rain. The front porch sagged slightly, and a porch swing swayed lazily in the breeze. He cut the engine, grabbed the old photograph, and stepped out. At first no one answered when he knocked. Then the door creaked open, and Elaine Grady stood there, aged by time but unmistakably Tom's sister. Her gray hair was tied back, and her piercing hazel eyes locked onto his. Jack removed his hat. "Elaine?" She blinked, her expression unreadable. "Jack Callahan?" For a moment neither spoke. Then she stepped back and waved him inside. The living room smelled like old books and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that belonged to a house filled with memories, not just furniture. Jack sat down on the worn-out couch, feeling out of place, like a man who had wandered too far from home. Elaine didn't waste time. "Why are you here?" Jack hesitated. He pulled out the photo, placing it gently on the coffee table. Elaine's breath hitched as she picked it up. "I found an old roll of film," Jack said. "Developed it last week. That was the last picture I ever took of Tom." Elaine traced her fingers over the image. She swallowed hard. "Where did you take this?" "Somewhere near the Laotian border, the night before he went missing." Her gaze flicked up. "And the message?" Jack nodded. "Coordinate." Elaine exhaled sharply, gripping the photo. Then, after a long silence, she said, "You need to talk to Nathan." Jack frowned. "Nathan?" Elaine looked him dead in the eye. "Tom's son." Jack felt a cold wave of disbelief settle over him. "Tom had a son?" All these years, and he never knew? Before he could process it, Elaine stood up. "He doesn't know much about his father," she said, her voice steady. "But maybe you're the one who can finally tell him." Jack exhaled, rubbing his tired face. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This was about telling a son the truth about a father he never met. Jack stood outside the small auto repair shop on the edge of town, the heat rising in waves off the asphalt. A sign above the garage doors read, "Grady's Auto and Towing." Inside, the rhythmic clang of a wrench against metal echoed through the open bay doors. Jack adjusted his hat and stepped forward. A man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with grease-streaked hands, worked under the hood of an old Chevy pickup. His jawline was sharp, his hair short but slightly unkempt. There was no mistaking it. This was Tom Grady's son. Jack cleared his throat. "Nathan?" The man straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before turning around. His eyes locked onto Jack's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "There," Nathan said, wary. "Who's asking?" Jack pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it out. Nathan frowned, taking the picture. His gaze scanned the image. His father, crouched in the jungle, eyes locked on something unseen. The message in the dirt beside him barely noticeable. Jack saw the moment recognition hit. This is my dad?" Nathan's voice was softer now, uncertain. Jack nodded. "The last photo I ever took of him." Nathan's jaw tightened. His hands, still dirty from work, trembled slightly as he held the picture. "My ma never talked about him," he admitted. "Not really. Just said he was a good man. That he never came home." Jack exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. "I was with him that night," Jack said. "He left us a message before he disappeared. I never saw it until now." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps before looking back at Jack. "You saying this is some kind of clue?" Jack nodded. "That's what I'm here to find out." Nathan let out a breath, still staring at the photo. "And you think I can help?" Jack hesitated. Your mother left you anything from him? Letters? Old belongings?" Nathan frowned, thinking. "There's a storage unit she kept after she passed. I never went through it." Jack's heartbeat quickened. "That's where we start," he said. Nathan looked at the photo one last time, then back at Jack. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's find out what my dad was trying to say." The storage unit was a rusted orange door, number 26, in a row of identical metal garages just outside of town. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old metal, the kind of place where memories didn't just sit, they decayed. Nathan stood beside Jack, arms crossed, staring at the lock. He had the key. He had it for years, but he had never been able to make himself open the unit. "You sure about this?" Nathan asked, his voice quieter than before. Jack nodded. "If there's anything left of your father in there, it's time to find it." Nathan inhaled sharply, then slid the key into the lock. With a metallic snap, the latch came loose, and he pushed the door up. A stale gust of air rolled out, carrying decades of neglect. Inside, the unit was packed. Boxes stacked haphazardly, a few old crates, and a dusty footlocker with a U.S. Army emblem still faintly visible. Jack stepped inside first, his hands trailing over a stack of faded files. Nathan followed, running his fingers over the old wooden footlocker. It felt like something his father might have touched. "This is his," Nathan muttered. Jack knelt beside it. "Then let's open it." Nathan unlatched the box and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, time had been frozen. A stack of letters, still bound together by an old rubber band. A few black and white photos of a younger Tom smiling in uniform. A tattered jungle map, marked with red ink, a circle drawn over the same coordinates from the photo. Jack's breath caught. "Your father knew something," he murmured. Nathan picked up one of the letters, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. The ink had faded, but the words still burned. "If anything happens to me, tell them I stayed behind by choice. I had to." Nathan's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" Jack clenched his jaw. It meant Tom Grady's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was something he chose to do, and if he had made that choice, someone else knew why. Jack pulled out the last item from the footlocker, a dog tag, but not Tom's. A name was scratched into the surface. Hank Rawlings. Jack's expression darkened. He's still alive? Nathan looked up, confused. Who? Jack held up the tag. The last man to see your father before he vanished. Jack and Nathan stood outside a run-down nursing home on the outskirts of Knoxville. The building's paint was peeling, the once pristine sign faded and cracked from years of neglect. It wasn't the kind of place where people came to visit. It was where they came to fade away. Jack clenched his jaw. Hank Rawlings had been listed as the last known survivor of Tom Grady's squad, but his records were buried deep. It took some digging. Nathan had pulled a few strings with a buddy at the VA records office, but they finally found him. Nathan shifted beside him. You think he's going to tell us anything? Jack adjusted his cap. We're about to find out. They stepped inside. The air smelled of antiseptic and something old, something tired. A nurse at the front desk barely looked up before directing them down the hall. Room 14B. Jack knocked, waiting. A raspy voice called from inside. If you're here to steal my pudding cup, at least have the decency to knock first. Jack smirked, pushing the door open. Inside, Hank Rawlings sat in a wheelchair by the window, a thin oxygen tube trailing from his nose. His skin was leathered with age, his body frail, but his eyes were sharp, watching them with a wary kind of intelligence. Nathan stepped forward. Mr. Rawlings? Hank let out a slow breath. Ain't been Mr. Anything in about 30 years, kid. His gaze flickered to Jack. And you look like someone who's got questions. Jack pulled out the photo of Tom. He handed it to Hank without a word. Hank's fingers trembled slightly as he brought the picture closer. His breath hitched. Jesus, he whispered. His eyes darkened, not with age, but with memory. Nathan stepped forward. You knew my dad, didn't you? Hank slowly looked up, studying Nathan's face. Grady? His voice cracked. Damn, you got his eyes. Jack sat on the edge of the bed. Hank, we need to know what happened to him. For a long moment, Hank just stared at the photo. Then he let out a ragged breath. You don't want to know. Jack's jaw tightened. We do. Hank closed his eyes. They told you he went missing? Jack nodded. Hank let out a bitter chuckle. He didn't go missing. He stayed behind. On purpose. Nathan's hands curled into fists. Why? Hank swallowed hard. Because he knew something. Jack's pulse quickened. Knew what? Hank finally looked him in the eye. That the war didn't end the way they said it did. Silence stretched between them. Hank coughed, his voice rasping. You want to know the truth about Tom Grady? His hand gripped the photo tighter. Then you'd better be ready for the kind of truth that gets men killed. Jack sat motionless, Hank's words hanging in the air like thick smoke. The war didn't end the way they said it did. The weight of that statement settled in his bones, pressing down like a lead vest. Across the room, Nathan was gripping the arm of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His father's absence had been a wound that never truly healed, and now, after decades of silence, the truth was finally within reach. But it wasn't the truth they expected. Hank shifted in his wheelchair, exhaling sharply, as if the memory alone was enough to wear him down. His eyes flicked to the photo again, tracing the image of Tom crouched in the jungle, the message in the dirt beside him. A set of coordinates, a call for something, someone. Jack could see it in Hank's face. The old man had carried this secret for too long, and now, with time slipping away, he was ready to let it go. You ever wonder, Hank started, his voice cracking, why they never found his body? Jack exchanged a look with Nathan, then turned back to Hank. They told us it was a bad area, that the jungle swallowed him up. Hank let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. That's the kind of thing they say when they don't want anyone looking. His fingers tapped against the photo as if the memory was clawing its way back. Your dad. He wasn't just another soldier, kid. He saw something. Something they didn't want him bringing home. Nathan leaned forward, his breath uneven. Saw what? Huh? Hank coughed, his voice turning raw. A deal? He licked his dry lips before continuing. I was there. Our unit was ordered to pull back from a hot zone, but Tom, he got curious. Heard whispers on the radio about an exchange, something that wasn't supposed to be happening. His eyes darkened. It wasn't a rescue op. It was a trade. Jack's stomach twisted. A trade? Hank nodded. Our guys were supposed to bring home POWs. That's what they told us. But that's not what happened. Some prisoners were sent back, yeah, but not all of them. Some of them just vanished. His voice dropped lower, barely a whisper. And Tom? He saw it happen. Nathan was breathing harder now. You're saying my father, he stayed behind because of this? Hank clenched his jaw, looking straight at Nathan. Tom knew if he went home, if he talked, he'd be dead before his boots hit American soil. He chose to disappear instead. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Tom's disappearance. This was about a cover-up. One that went far beyond a lost soldier in the jungle. Nathan swallowed hard, his voice almost breaking. So? What now? Hank sighed, leaning back in his chair. You want to find out what really happened to your dad? He gestured toward a drawer in his bedside table. You're going to need this. Jack hesitated before reaching for it. Inside was a faded military file, yellowed at the edges, thick with dust. Hank's hands trembled as he pushed it toward them. This is what's left of it. The records they didn't burn. Jack and Nathan locked eyes. This was it. The last piece of the puzzle. But were they ready for what it revealed? Jack sat at the edge of the hospital bed, the faded military file resting heavily in his hands. The pages felt thin, fragile, as if the weight of history itself threatened to tear them apart. Nathan stood behind him, arms crossed, his breath shallow as he tried to prepare himself for what was inside. Hank Rawlings, the last living witness to Tom Grady's final days, watched them from his wheelchair, his oxygen machine humming softly. Go on, Hank rasped. Open it. Jack inhaled deeply before peeling back the brittle cover. The first few pages were routine, deployment orders, combat reports, medical evaluations. But then, buried between the layers of official documents, was something that shouldn't have been there. A declassified memo stamped with a fading red seal. Operation Smoke Secret Seal 90 classified. Intel report, 1971. Jack's pulse quickened. He skimmed through the lines of dense typewritten text, his eyes catching on fragments of chilling details. All transfers authorized without official documentation. Civilian assets in conflict zones neutralized under discretionary orders. Final Oversight Committee authorized containment of classified intelligence leaks. And then, at the bottom of the page, a name that hit him like a freight train. Thomas Grady. Thomas Grady. That's just... Jack's fingers tightened around the page. His voice was barely above a whisper. They covered him up. Nathan, standing rigid, stepped closer. What do you mean? Jack turned the file toward him. Your dad didn't go missing because of enemy fire. He didn't disappear because he got left behind. He disappeared because he saw something he wasn't supposed to. Nathan took the file, scanning the report, his eyes darkening with every word. His breath hitched when he found the last note on the bottom of the last page. Subject compromised, containment measures authorized, operation concluded. Nathan's jaw clenched. They killed him. Hank sighed, rubbing his temple. Not exactly. They didn't have to. They just had to make sure no one ever found him. Nathan's grip on the file tightened until the paper crumpled under his fingers. His voice was shaking now. All this time... They just buried him in paperwork. Jack exhaled sharply. They erased him. A bitter silence filled the room. Nathan slammed the file shut, his breath unsteady. He turned toward Hank. "Why the hell didn't you tell anyone?" Hank's gaze was heavy. "You think anyone would have listened? We were ghosts the moment we left that jungle." His voice cracked with something raw, something that had been locked away for decades. "But I remember, kid. I never forgot what they did to your father." Nathan swallowed hard, his hands shaking. "So what do we do now?" Jack stared at the closed file. The weight of it, the truth of it, was something men had died to keep hidden. But the world had changed since 1971, and maybe, just maybe, it was finally time for Tom Grady's name to be spoken again. Jack's voice was low but firm. "We bring him home." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Jack stood still, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, the chill of the stone monument seeping into his bones. Beside him, Nathan held the photograph of his father, gripping it like an anchor. They had done everything they could. The truth, once buried beneath layers of deception, had finally been unearthed. After weeks of pushing through government red tape, making calls, forcing the right people to listen, they had succeeded in what once seemed impossible. Tom Grady's name was added to the wall. Jack had never thought he'd see the day. The engraving was fresh, the letters still sharp. Thomas Grady, 194711971. A name no longer erased, a sacrifice no longer ignored. Nathan stepped forward first. He pressed his fingers against the cold stone, tracing the letters of his father's name. His breath hitched, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I spent my whole life wondering about you," Nathan murmured. "And now I finally know." Jack swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the wall. "He'd be proud of you, kid." Nathan turned to him, eyes glistening. "I should be saying that to you. If it wasn't for you, I never would have found him." Jack shook his head. "No. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here at all." Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out the dog tags Jack had given him. Tom's dog tags. For decades they had been missing, presumed lost along with their owner, but now they were finally home. Nathan knelt down and placed them at the base of the wall. A moment passed. The world seemed to stand still. Jack exhaled, feeling something inside him settle for the first time in years. The guilt, the unanswered questions, the weight of carrying the past. It was finally lifted. Tom Grady had been more than just another name lost to war. He had been a father, a friend, a soldier who chose to stay behind to do what was right. And now, at long last, his story had been told. Jack took the last copy of the photograph, the one he had kept for himself, and leaned it against the wall beside the dog tags. The image of Tom crouched in the jungle, the message scrawled in the dirt, the look in his eyes that still held meaning decades later. Jack took a step back, nodding to himself. Some stories never truly end. They just wait to be found. Fade to black. Jack Callahan and Nathan Grady walk away from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, their shadows stretching across the granite walkway as the morning sun rises behind them. The past, once buried beneath layers of secrecy and silence, has finally been unearthed. Tom Grady's name, now etched into the black stone, is no longer lost to forgotten records or bureaucratic red tape. He stands among his fallen brothers, honored at last. The world moves on around them, tourists and veterans quietly passing by, some pausing to touch the names of their own loved ones, their whispers carried away in the soft morning breeze. Nathan grips the last photograph of his father in his hands, his calloused fingers running over the edges, as if holding on to the only tangible proof that Tom Grady had lived, had fought, had chosen sacrifice over survival. His father was no longer just a ghost in an old war story. He was a man who had made the ultimate choice, a hero who had refused to let the truth be buried with him. Nathan swallows hard, his hazel eyes glassy, but there's something else in them now. A quiet acceptance, a sense of closure he never thought he'd find. He kneels one last time, pressing the dog tags against the stone beneath his father's name, a final tribute to a man who had been denied his honor for far too long. Jack watches him, his piercing blue eyes heavy with understanding. He has spent decades carrying the weight of the past, but today that burden feels lighter. He places a hand on Nathan's shoulder, offering no words because none are needed. The truth has been found, and justice, long delayed, has been delivered. Some wounds never fully heal, but today, one chapter closes. Tom Grady's story, once silenced, has finally been told. He is no longer missing, no longer forgotten. He is home.